You may have heard of cheat codes, barcodes, maybe even chain codes, but have you ever heard of black codes? Hi, my name is Daniel, and today I'm going to talk to you about the black codes. Slavery is widely considered one of the most heinous and debilitating acts one could commit on his fellow man. The United States, a nation that has prided itself on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for the entirety of its existence, has denied many of those core rights to an entire race of people, let alone several other groups of people coming to or residing in the United States. Though the US would go on to abolish slavery, similar to many of its contemporary nations at the time, it would be a relatively slow process. In fact, it got much worse before it got better. It would eventually culminate into a massive civil war that spread death, destruction, and misery into nearly every facet of society. Though by the time of its conclusion, it would result in legislation being proposed and soon after passed that would result in the complete emancipation of all slaves. It would, however, also lead to a system that disenfranchised and discriminated against colored minorities, the consequences of which the U.S. still battles with to this very day. One of these systems was the institution of the Black Codes in the South. These codes were created to were created to preserve a sense of white supremacy in the South right after the Civil War. Though, in a, though they were ineffective in remaining legal for more than a few months, their impact had significant ramifications. But before we get into that, here were just a little context. With an estimated 1.5 million casualties, 620,000 of whom were killed in action, the U.S. Civil War remains the bloodiest war for U.S. troops in American history. Which goes without saying, considering the only combatants were Americans, because that's how civil wars go. Bathed the nation in blood for both U.S. and Confederate soldiers for almost 4 years to the exact day, mind you, almost to the exact day, mind you. It would effectively end with the concession of Confederate General Robert E. Lee to Union General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th, 1865. The Confederate States would be put under martial law until Washington felt as though they were fit to govern themselves without passing any racial or oppressive laws that discriminated against blacks. And this all worked out, nothing bad ever happened. Except it did. As soon as the war ended, many Southern governments put in place black codes, starting with South Carolina and spreading across the South. The black codes were created not only to disenfranchise blacks, but the codes were also sought to retain some of the familiar practices and treatments of blacks seen under slavery. Some codes, such as one passed by Mississippi, required that free men, free Negroes, and mulatto, these are Native Americans, shall on the second Monday of January 1866 and annually thereafter have a lawful home or employment. Essentially saying that if you were black or, again, Native American and did not have a legal home or job, at their discretion, of course, you could and would be arrested for vagrancy. This same law also stated that if a black man quit his job before fulfilling his contract, he would have to forfeit his wages for that physical year up to the time of quitting. Failure to do so might result in being returned to the employer, and he would likely work for this employer until his debt could be paid off. And these debts were often inflated. This would this would be like if you were to quit your job as a factory worker today. Then you were forced to not only repay everything that you had made up to that point in that physical year, but then you could be forced to continue to work there at the same for the same employer for the same in the same or in worse conditions, basically for however they wanted you to work. Either that, or you could be put in prison system, which for blacks mainly was often the death sentence, since the prisons were often cramped, rife with disease, and were not well maintained. The codes were a major point of contention between abolitionists and white Southerners. Opponents of the Black Code argued that that the laws were necessary and justified. One Southern, Seth Lawton, opinions reflect what many Southerners came to believe, saying, "We, like thousands of others, have seen how indolent and worthless the Negro has become in 9 cases out of 10 since the elevation to freedom." Others, like Charles H. Waney, pushed for separation between the races and even compared blacks to monkeys and thought nothing higher of them. However, there were also those who supported blacks, like Horace Greeley, who argued, "We only ask justice for the Negro. Let him alone. Give him opportunity and stand off. If he is lazy, let him starve. He will soon find his level. Give him a fair field, just as you give a blue-eyed German or a swarthy Pole." As by as put by a Southern officer, black freedom must be limited to black freedom must be limited, controlled, and surrounded with such safeguards that would make the charges as slight as possible. As put by a Southern Carolina officer, black freedom must be limited, controlled, and surrounded with such safeguards as will make the changes as slight as possible. The general interest of both the white man and the Negro require that he should be kept as or as near the condition as slavery as far from the condition as practicable. Fortunately, in 1866, both the House and the Senate would issue the Civil Rights Act of 1866, effectively banning the black code. However, a simple law cannot fix decades, if not potentially centuries of racially motivated discrimination. The Reconstruction era government was rife with corruption throughout both the North and the South. The federal government was divided between Andrew Johnson and the Republicans, as well as Democrats, not agreeing on the issue of what to do with the freedmen. With Johnson essentially allowing for the Confederate Democrats, which are which were then tactically considered traitors, to hold office again, which would eventually lead to years of progress in black equality being halted and in many ways reversed. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was created to fix this short. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, or the Enforcement Act, was created to fix the shortcomings of the first Civil Rights Act. However, the Supreme Court ruled that in the Civil Rights case of 1883, that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional, and that the 13th and 14th Amendments did not allow the Congress to regulate the affairs of private citizens. 13 years later, in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, the court ruled that a private business could racially separate a combination so as long as there were equal or separate but equal laws. This paved the way for Jim Crow laws to be put in place throughout the South, destroying decades of progress almost overnight. These laws would not be rendered illegal until the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Though long gone, the Black Codes had a profound effect on American culture and society, the consequences of which the U.S. still rattles with to this day. As previously mentioned, the Jim Crow laws that seemed to be one of the defining symbols of racism of the 20th century and can be traced their roots back to the Black Codes. What these laws and others practices that supported it did was perpetuate the hatred and bigotry directed towards colored people. The label of these laws may be gone, but some of their purposes are still prevalent. One of these examples is the Shelby County versus Holder case. The case itself seemed to be reasonable. Shelby County, Alabama, argued that Section 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. Section 4 outlined which states would be put under under the restrictions in Section 5, while Section 5 outlined the restrictions. Section 5 contained a provision that required certain jurisdictions with long histories of racially motivated voter suppression, such as requiring tests or devices to vote, must obtain federal approval before making these changes in the voting rules. Given the county, given the county the benefit of the doubt, the court ruled in favor of Shelby County, and these restrictions were lifted. And so they got rid of the silly old laws that were outdated and were definitely in no way anyone could abuse their power by making new laws that could directly violate the now void Section 4 and 5. Except someone did, and right after Section 5, 4 and 5 were repealed, Alabama introduced a requirement for voter IDs to vote, and then proceeded to close down a number of local driver's license offices in counties with a high percentage of minority populations. Though the U.S. is a far cry from where it was, though the U.S. is a far cry from where it used to be when it comes to racial violence and suppression of minorities in the social and political theater, there is still much more to be done. The past decade has been contentious, to say the least, in regards to race relations in the United States. More recently, protests by Black Lives Matter and its supporters during the summer of 2020 as a response to the brutal death of George Floyd have given new life to the fight against police brutality and the greater issue of respecting civil rights given to every citizen and inhabitant of the United States. Frederick Douglass once said, "It is easier to build a strong child than to repair a broken man." Though I am in no way implying that the older generation is a lost cause and whatever preconceived belief that they have about race and inequality is set in stone, I am saying that it is important for the U.S. to foster a society that treats everyone as equals, or at least as much as a capitalist society can, and prevent a sense of racial supremacy of any kind, so that it might limit the thoughts from seeping into the minds of Americans, especially those of our